Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Toby Young. Toby, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brendan.
So, first things first, congratulations on your peerage.
Thank you very much.
Very well deserved. I won't be calling you Lord Young. I'm still going to call you Toby, but there you go.
I think that's true of most people, Brendan.
So, Toby, let's talk about the year in free speech. And it's a good time to look back on what's been going on this with this most important liberty in the UK. In your capacity as one of Britain's best-known free speech campaigners, you've got a lot to say on this issue. And you've written an excellent piece for Spiked about all the ups and downs for freedom of speech in 2024. So I want to talk about a bit of that with you. And I want to start off by asking you about how bad the Labour government has been, because you say in your piece that you were pretty scared of a Labour government, the prospect of a Labour government and what it would do for freedom of speech. And you say in your piece that it's actually turned out to be worse than you'd expected. So give us a taste, give us a flavour of how bad things have been since Labour took over.
Yeah, well, they've been pretty bad. I think we all had low expectations, but Keir Starmer has underperformed even by those low standards. A contributor to the Daily Sceptic, which I put together, came up with a great phrase, which is Starmer's Britain is like North Korea run by David Brent. And it often feels that way. What's he done? Well, there was some nasty things in the Labour Party manifesto, like the fully trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices. That hasn't yet been presented before Parliament in the form of a bill, but I think that's coming next year. I think Starmer's reaction to the Southport attack and its aftermath very much betrayed his authoritarian character, urging the authorities to clamp down not just on people who were involved in the riots, but on people who had commented on the Southport attack or the disorder that followed in a way which was supposedly inflammatory or fomented disorder or was stirring up racial hatred, often on the most tenuous of basis. And lots of people were arrested and charged just because of things they'd said about those events on social media, not because they'd participated in them at all. And nearly all of them, I regret to say, pleaded guilty. And not surprising, perhaps, because they didn't fancy being held on remand for months before their cases came to trial. They may have been poorly advised by duty solicitors. The police may have put other forms of pressure on them to plead guilty. But for whatever reason, most of the people charged with speech crimes in the aftermath of the Southport attack pleaded guilty and ended up in prison. I think the number's approaching 100 now. And the Free Speech Union has got involved in some of those cases. We're appealing in some cases the sentences, in some cases the verdict and the sentences. One guy, former Royal Marine in Wales, has pleaded not guilty to stirring up racial hatred based on a video he posted on Facebook, which I don't think came anywhere near the threshold for a criminal offence. He pleaded not guilty, and we're defending him. We've got a barrister and a solicitor. Spike's own Luke Gittos is his criminal solicitor, and we hope we'll get a not guilty verdict in his case. But I was shocked. I think a lot of people were shocked by the clampdown on dissent from people, venting, essentially, expressing their anger on social media platforms. Quite extraordinary. And Starmer himself said when he was Director of Public Prosecutions in 2013 that there are lots of laws on the statute books that would enable the authorities to essentially imprison people for hurty words on social media. But 99% of the time, it's better that they just delete the offending tweet and apologize. That was his attitude then. These laws are, for the most part, latent. They're not activated. If they were, we would turn into a much more authoritarian country. Well, since the Southport attack over the summer, they have now been activated. And, dozens of people have been arrested, charged and imprisoned for essentially hurty words on social media. And one of the consequences of that is that membership at the Free Speech Union has skyrocketed. So we were on just under 14,000 members on July 4th. But since then, it's grown to about 24,000 members. So, we thought of sending Keir Starmer some kind of Christmas gift for being the best recruiting sergeant ever for the Free Speech Union. But, it's not actually funny. It's people terrified that they're going to get their collars felt for things they've said, often in the distant past. And, that's not an unrealistic fear, as we saw in the case of Alison Pearson. Two police officers turning up on her doorstep on Remembrance Sunday to interview her about something that she tweeted more than a year ago and which she deleted almost immediately. And they were, it turned out, investigating her for the crime of I think stirring up racial hatred, and that carries a maximum of 7 years in prison. So certainly no laughing matter. And the Free Speech Union was able to help her. Again, Luke got on the case, and in the end, she was told there'd be no further action. But maybe someone without her profile, who wasn't a member of the Free Speech Union, in similar circumstances, could have ended up in jail. So that's been sort of horrific and terrifying, and a surprise even to those of us who didn't have a high opinion of Starmer to begin with. What else have they done? I mean, there was that awful moment in the House of Commons when an Islamic MP asked Keir Starmer essentially whether Labour was going to bring back blasphemy laws. They were the emphasis on prosecuting people for, desecrating the Quran. And Starmer didn't rule it out. That was. I think even I was surprised that he didn't rule out bringing back blasphemy laws. But I think that may happen in some form in the next Parliament. I don't think that, or rather next year. I don't think an act of parliament will be passed criminalising Islamophobia. But what might happen is, via a statutory instrument or something similar, the threshold, the prosecutorial threshold for stirring up religious hatred could be lowered. At the moment, the threshold is lower for racial hatred than it is for stirring up religious hatred. In the case of religious hatred, to secure a prosecution, you need to be able to show not only that what someone said was likely to stir up religious hatred, but that they intended to do so when they said it. In the case of racial hatred, it's enough that it was likely to, even if you didn't intend it to. And it may be that, on some spurious pretext, like just bringing the stirring up offences into line with each other and ironing out inconsistencies, they'll lower the threshold for stirring up religious hatred, and anything defined as Islamophobia by the extraordinarily capacious definition adopted by the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, their definition of Islamophobia, which includes pointing out that at some points in the past, Islam has been imposed on conquered populations by force. That's one of that. Apparently saying that, according to the APPG's definition, is a form of Islamophobia. So, who knows? Tom Holland could be prosecuted for Islamophobia, or for rather stirring up religious hatred if the prosecutorial threshold is lowered. At the very least, all his books would have to be pulp. So that's another big threat looming before us. I think maybe the worst thing, Brendan, that this government's done is bring in the Employment Rights Act, which I don't think many people are aware of this particularly odious clause in the Act. I think maybe even Angela Rayner, who is the sort of architect of the bill, isn't aware of it. I say Act, I mean bill. One of the Free Speech Union's victories in the last Parliament was to essentially neuter something called the Worker Protection Bill, which did become the Worker Protection Act. Now, it takes a bit of explaining, so bear with me, but you'll recall that there was this scandal involving something called the President's Club, in which these two undercover FT journalists kind of were employed as waitresses at this fundraising event. I think it was at the Dorchester. And they were sexually harassed by some of the guests. It was a kind of bunch of plutocrats giving money to causes and all getting drunk, and all men together behaving badly. And what these undercover FT journalists discovered is that if you're an employee and you're sexually harassed by a third party, you can't sue your employer under the Equality Act for not doing more, not taking all reasonable steps to protect you from sexual harassment. The Equality Act doesn't cover third-party harassment, including third-party sexual harassment. So a private member's bill was introduced in the last Parliament to try and remedy this defect in the Equality Act. But they didn't just, in this bill, want to extend employer liability for third-party sexual harassment, but for all forms of harassment by third parties. And according to the Employment Tribunal, the Equality Act means that if you, as an employee, overhear a conversation between two other employees, not directed at you, but which nonetheless may be offensive or upsetting to another employee in virtue of their protected characteristics, then you can sue the employer for not doing more to protect the vulnerable employees from being offended or upset in this way. Overheard conversations. And we thought, well, this is horrific. What will happen to bars, pubs, restaurants? Will it mean that employers in the hospitality sector will have to take all reasonable steps to protect their employees from overhearing conversations between customers, which they may find upsetting or offensive in virtue of their protected characteristics? Will publicans have to employ banter bouncers to, kick people out who are telling dirty jokes in the back of the pub, lest those jokes be overheard by a, sensitive member of the bar staff? In football stadiums, if an overexcited fan, when a linesman kind of rules a goal offside, shouts out, "Are you blind?" which, by the way, happens a lot at Queen's Park Rangers, then, any fan could sue the club for not doing more to protect a partially sighted steward from overhearing such a remark, which would be offensive or upsetting in virtue of his disabilities. So, almost all football chants would be ruled offside effectively by a law, if the Equality Act was extended in that way. Every football stadium would become a library. I mean, away fans at the Emirates chanting, "Is this a library?" If you were an Arsenal fan, you just point at Keir Starmer in his kind of super luxurious executive box and say, yes, it is a library, thanks to him. Be quiet now. Anyway, so we managed with our allies in the Lords to get this ridiculous clause stripped out of the Worker Protection Bill. So when the Worker Protection Bill finally found its way onto the statute books, it only made employers liable for third-party sexual harassment, not other forms of harassment. We thought that was a victory, and we didn't think it would come back in this Parliament because, after all, the impetus for making this change to the Equality Act was to protect women from sexual harassment, which, is fair enough. But in the Employment Rights Bill, the clause we managed to get stripped out of the Worker Protection Bill has found its way back almost word for word. It's as if, activist civil servants in the Government Equality Office, or the Government Equality and Opportunity Office, as it's now called. They keep changing the names of these things, Brendan. The stationer in Whitehall must be driving a gold-plated Bentley. The number of times they need to change the stationery of these ridiculous departments and sub-departments. Anyway, activist civil servants in this department clearly just copied and pasted this thing we'd managed to get stripped out of one bill and put it in another. And I'm not even sure Labour realises it's going to have a devastating effect on the hospitality sector, which is already on its knees. The Saracen's Head. I mean, those signs will have to go for starters. I mean, it's just so unbelievably short-sighted, tin-eared of this government when, the number of jobs that'll be lost in the hospitality sector if suddenly there is this extraordinary red tape, this kind of voluminous red tape they'll have to comply with to protect their employees from overhearing conversations amongst customers. I mean, the chilling effect of the Equality Act, which is currently confined to the workplace, which has everyone looking over their shoulder and saying, "Oh, can you say that?" That's going to be extended to every area of our lives. So that, I think, that is the most Stalinist measure so far, but I'm sure it'll be surpassed by something in next year.
That's a really useful and very sobering overview of what's been going on under this government over the past few months and what might yet come under this government. And when I was reading your piece that you've written for us, it was that part of it that leapt out at me, the Employment Rights Bill and this clause about protecting employees from third-party offence. Because you think to yourself, well, gender-critical women have already been thrown out of pubs, simply for supposedly being offensive or wearing T-shirts with the word woman on them. you can imagine if this kind of law were ever to go through, gender critical women would never be able to go out for a drink. Every one of their conversations would be deemed offensive to, potentially offensive to an employee. So yeah, the banter bouncers in pubs, that prospect is deeply Stalinist, as you say. I want to dig into some of these things in a little bit more detail. But I want to go back to the thing you started off with, which is the post-Southport, post-riots moment, and what you think that told us about the new government and the new bureaucracy that we live under. I'm saying this, by the way, as someone who doesn't think that the Tories did a very good job on freedom of speech at all, but it does look as though things could get even worse under Labour. In my mind, this will be remembered as a year in which Hugh Edwards spent not a minute in jail, despite having incredibly disturbing images of children, whereas a 53-year-old woman, who, by the way, was the sole carer for her husband, was sentenced to 15 months in jail for writing something horrible on Facebook during the riots. So it really was an eye-opening year in terms of the two-tier justice, the two-tier approach to crimes that people commit, and this determination to punish people for things they say. But so what do you think that moment told us about how the Labour bureaucracy views speech itself and ordinary people? And also, were some of those cases in the post-Southport moment quite difficult for you? Because some of the speech that we're talking about did include misinformation. Some of it did include pretty ugly, insightful commentary, don't rebuild the mosque, burn it down. I mean, these are nasty sentiments. I am of the view that even those kinds of things should not be punished if they are not direct forms of incitement, but they are difficult things to defend in the public realm sometimes. So how did you find that moment? What do you think it told us about the state of free speech now?
Yeah, well, I think it told us that this government believes that the cause of the disorder that broke out after the Southport attack was not roiling public anger about mass migration, about the risk that migration on this scale poses to ordinary people, including children. No, it was nothing to do with that. It was just the product of mis- and disinformation whipped up in particular on Elon Musk's X. And on the face of it, you would think, well, perhaps they're just looking for a scapegoat. This government doesn't want to grasp this particular nettle. They're not going to do much about illegal migration or legal migration. So easier to blame mis- and disinformation and Elon Musk. But actually, I think they do genuinely believe it, Brendan. I think they think that some forms of so-called misinformation and disinformation, which is often just, a euphemism for dissenting from, various radical progressive principles, they genuinely believe that it's extraordinarily harmful and poses a real threat to our democracy. And therefore, there's nothing undemocratic about punishing people for trafficking in misinformation or disinformation. But I think one of the things which exposed that analysis as incredibly threadbare and clearly politically motivated is that, as you say, people trafficking in misinformation on one side of the political divide were severely punished, whereas those trafficking in misinformation on the other were generally let off scot-free or much less severely punished. The kind of great example is the head of Hate Not Hope, who claimed wrongly on X that a Muslim woman had had acid thrown into her face by a far-right anti-immigration protester, which turned out to be false, but could just as easily have led to attacks on people identified as far-right protesters by marauding mobs of, young Muslim men, as other things that were said and which were severely punished. One example of two-tier justice I became aware of is that Lucy Connolly, the wife of the Conservative councillor who did say something genuinely unpleasant at the height of the disturbances, and pleaded guilty and went to jail for, I think, 41 months. The same judge that sentenced her to 41 months had someone up before him who had led a mob of young Muslim men on an attack on a pub, and they'd beaten up the guy standing outside the pub and then tried to break the pub door down. And I think he had like a bat. And, there were women and children inside the pub cowering behind these doors with this mob outside trying to batter the door down. And he got a much lower sentence than Lucy Connolly, which was extraordinary, given that he'd actually participated in the disorder, not just commented on it. But there were just countless examples like that. And, when people, on the progressive left say something that's false and potentially harmful, it's not defined as misinformation. People think, oh, just an innocent mistake, and if they corrected it, then that's enough. Whereas people on, supposedly on the far right, identified as being on the far right, we can get into that can of worms, much less latitude it was extended to them over the summer. It was as if the various laws against speech, certain forms of speech, were being weaponized by the regime to suppress dissent, to suppress what they identified as heresy. And any criticism, particularly robust criticism of multiculturalism, of mass immigration, of the impact that mass immigration is having on our public services, that in our society, in the eyes of our regime, is a form of heresy and should be punished.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And it's been so clear over the past few years that hate speech laws are very often designed not just to tackle speech that all of us would recognize as genuinely hateful, even though I don't think that speech should be censored, but also to tackle speech that is simply dissenting in one form or another. So people who are overly critical of something like mass immigration, or people who make supposedly blasphemous comments about Islam, or people who oppose same-sex marriage. I mean, all sorts of people who hold particular beliefs can find themselves being swept up in hate speech style punishment. So yeah, I think you're right that there is this sinister attempt to clamp down on dissent, but it gets dressed up as a war on hateful speech or bigotry. But alongside that, the other thing that really comes through in your piece and the things that you've been doing over the past few months is that as well as this kind of regime clamp down on dissenting ideas or, people saying things that you're not supposed to say about politics, etc., there is also just this desire to sanitize the whole of society. And I think one thing that's become clear in the first few months of the Labour government is that censorship these days is very often just a form of sanitization, draining the life out of society, draining any risky speech or jokey speech or fun speech. So you talk about the football governance bill, which you say is very likely to go through next year, which will call on football clubs to promote EDI stuff even more than they already do. And we're talking about rainbow laces, knee taking, all that stuff already exists in football. And we know that Newcastle FC gave a gendercritical feminist a 2-season ban because she said that men aren't women, men can't become women. And you mentioned already the banter bouncers that might come if we have that clause in the Employment Rights Bill. There is an instinct, isn't there, among that layer of society, not only to clamp down on speech that they find politically problematic, but also just to make sure that everyone is constantly minding their P's and Q's and being very politically correct and prim. And to try and impose that kind of thing on football, of all places, really sums up how aloof they are from ordinary people, I think.
Yes, there is this puritanical impulse which seems to run through this government, whereby, as you say, they want to sanitize aspects of our lives, which are currently, less pleased than other aspects. It's almost as though they don't like the idea that people can kind of just spontaneously let off steam, express their joy or exuberance about something in a kind of unlettered way. They want to kind of impose this kind of, they want to kind of disinfect all these environments that they regard as kind of suspect and toxic. And the more working class the environment, football games being, the prime example, or at least perceived as being working class by our puritanical masters, the more likely they are to want to intervene to make those environments, quote unquote, safe. It's as though they really do believe that people overhearing certain forms of speech is a threat to their safety. It's a threat to their psychological well-being. And for them, why they're in politics is to protect people they've identified as being vulnerable, at risk. And it's not enough to kind of impose health and safety red tape on all these environments. It now has to be extended to protecting people from hearing things that they might find upsetting or offensive in all walks of life. It's a kind of weird impulse to kind of take the joy out of life, stop people letting their hair down, letting off steam, behaving in a sort of uncontrolled, spontaneous way. They hate it. It's the same impulse, I'm sure, which prompted Cromwell to cancel Christmas. It's only a matter of time, Brendan, before they come for Christmas. And of course, in many respects, they have come for Christmas, the kind of joy detectives. You can't say it anymore in various environments, but this is what we're up against, I think. It's a kind of strand in the English character that's always been there and always been at war with the more kind of bacchanalian, raspberry-blowing, seaside postcard half of the kind of British character. It's as though there is this kind of schism in the British national soul. And when Boris was in Downing Street, it was basically Benny Hill, in Number 10. And it was a kind of the ultimate expression of the other side, the cavalier, kind of licentious side of the British character. And now there's been a reaction. And now we have the opposite. We now have, the warden from Dad's Army in charge and determined to just kind of wipe out joy wherever he finds it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right that there is, particularly when it's a working class arena or what is perceived to be a working class arena, nothing fills the establishment with more dread than the thought of what is being said in those places or what is being done in those places. I've been watching the Darts World Championships over the past few days, and it feels like the last island of unpoliced behavior. They still got dancing girls and everyone's drunk and there's lots of rowdy chanting. And I keep thinking, God, I hope no one at The Guardian finds out about this because it will be game over. Even darts will go.
The FT will send a couple of undercover journalists to work as darts girls and it'll all be over after that. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, you mentioned already the Islamophobia question, and you don't think the government will introduce a law expressly forbidding so-called Islamophobic speech, but they might, in other ways, bring about a kind of chilling effect on people's right to be critical of Islam. I did want to ask you about that in particular, because that's a good example of an issue that you're very familiar with, which is the crossover between legal clampdowns on speech and just a cultural demonization of speech. And so very often you don't actually need instruments of law to prevent people from saying certain things, because there is cultural pressure on us from the top down in various different ways not to say certain things or not to hold certain beliefs. So, even though we don't have a particular law saying you can't blaspheme against Muhammad, people have been punished for allegedly doing that. So, the Batley grammar school teacher is still in hiding, so far as we know, because he showed his kids in his class an image of Muhammad. The film The Lady of Heaven was excised from most cinemas in the country because fundamentalist mobs showed up and said it was blasphemous against their prophet. Louis Smith, the gymnast, was banned from his sport for a few months because there was a video of him drunk making fun of the idea that you get 72 virgins when you die. That was supposedly blasphemous as well. So how important do you think it would be for Labour to bring in a law. Haven't the Islamophobia police kind of already won? And I wonder, how do you challenge something like that when it's in the cultural ethos rather than being an actual instrument of law?
Yes. Well, no, you're absolutely right. We do have effectively an anti-Islamic blasphemy law, or rather an Islamic blasphemy law, which is already enforced in all sorts of ways, even though it's not actually on the statute books. And I think challenging that is really difficult. I think the fact that the authorities clearly sympathize with people who do get very offended and upset when people insult the Prophet or depict the Prophet in cartoon form or supposedly disrespect the Quran, there seems to be an enormous amount of sympathy with that reaction on the part of the authorities, which makes it much, much harder to push back against it. To take the example of the Batley Grammar School religious studies teacher, he was suspended by his school when the mob started forming up at the school gate, possibly out of fear, wanting to diffuse the situation. But the head teacher cited the British values that English schools are expected to promote, one of which is tolerance and respect for different religions and belief. And I remember when I tried to persuade someone in Downing Street that we needed to include free speech amongst the British values that at least schools in England are expected to promote, they said, well, we don't have to do that because that's already protected by the value which says you need to respect and tolerate different religions or belief. But that was actually cited by the head teacher as a reason to suspend the religious studies teacher in Batley. So it clearly isn't doing the work that an additional value requiring schools to promote free speech is doing. And the teaching unions, none of the teaching unions stood up for that teacher. When there was a similar episode at a high school in Kettlethorpe, you probably remember this, a boy lost a bet with three of his mates, and the forfeit was he'd have to bring a copy of the Quran into the school. He was only 14. He brought the copy of the Quran into school. They were kind of fooling around in the playground, and it fell to the ground and got slightly scuffed. And again, a mob began to form up. These boys have disrespected the holy book. What's the school going to do about it? What are the police going to do about it? And, the boys' families started receiving death threats. And the police, instead of investigating the death threats, kind of arranged this kind of community meeting in which the mother of the boy who dropped the Quran, seemingly by accident, had to kind of appear before this kind of angry mob of Muslim men in a mosque, I think it was, with a headscarf on, head bowed. And the police reassured the congregation that these boys were being investigated thoroughly by the police, and if any crime had been committed, they would definitely prosecute them. And eventually, they had non-crime hate incidents recorded against their names. No one who threatened the boys' parents, with all kinds of horrible consequences, none of them got into trouble. None of them had NCHIs recorded against their names, but these four boys did. The Free Speech Union went into bat and managed to get those NCHIs removed from those boys' names. But absolutely extraordinary. But given that these informal backdoor blasphemy laws are effectively sanctioned by the unions, by schools, by police, then it's little wonder that they're getting more and more traction and are harder and harder to fight. And just on the subject of NCHIs, Brendan, Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, has actually said that she wants the police to record more non-crime hate incidents against people accused of Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. So even though it may be that this government isn't going to actually criminalize Islamophobia, nonetheless, by encouraging the police to record more NCHIs against people accused of Islamophobia, that's definitely going to have a chilling effect. I mean, these are the kind of instruments the authorities use now to suppress what they think of as unacceptable speech. they don't criminalize it, although they have done in various respects, but they don't just criminalize it. There's this kind of grey area in which something can be legal, but you can nevertheless get into trouble for saying it with the police. And it can be, the fact that you've got into trouble can be recorded in a police database in such a way that it shows up on your criminal record when you do an enhanced DBS check, if you apply for a job as a teacher or a carer or working in the voluntary sector. It's a kind of, one of the sacrosanct principles of English common law. One of the things which differentiated English common law from the Napoleonic Code is that unless something was explicitly prohibited, then it was permitted. And this is one of the kind of linchpins of English liberty. And but this is a grey area in which something isn't explicitly prohibited by law, but it's still not really permitted. This is why I dislike the legal but harmful principle that was initially in the online safety bill. It's a grey area. It's a departure from that sacrosanct principle of English common law, which has been a bulwark of our liberties for centuries. But this is what we're up against. And those are the kind of tools, I think, that will be used to try and suppress Islamophobia, broadly defined, rather than an actual change to the criminal law.
Yeah, and that instance you mentioned of the young boy who scuffed a page in the Quran and his mother being dragged before a mob of angry men, essentially. I remember watching that a couple of years back and thinking, this is the public shaming of a woman for the sins of the son, the supposed sins of the son, which weren't even particularly sinful. And I just remember thinking, where are the feminists speaking out against this shaming of a woman? Where are where's liberty? Where are those old kind of civil liberties groups? Why are they not commenting on this kind of spectacle? And I think it's possible we'll see more of that because there is so little intellectual or political pushback against this cultural demonization of so-called Islamophobia. Right, you mentioned non-crime hate incidents and Yvette Cooper's desire to lower the threshold for the recording of them, which you also write about in your piece. And I did want to ask you about those. You've just summarized them very well there. But, I mean, sometimes I think about non-crime hate incidents and I almost can't believe that they're a real thing. Because, firstly, because of all the crazy things that get swept up in them, everything from a playground joke through to a Home Secretary's speech on immigration, which, traditionally would have been seen as a legitimate thing for a politician to do, to express her views in the public realm. But apparently that can be a non-crime hate incident now as well. Isn't this just the most extraordinary form of mission creep for the reasons you've just outlined there, which is that, we're talking here about speech that is not illegal or not expressly illegal, but it can still find itself onto the police books. It can still find itself onto your record at some level. Do you think that that's a kind of mission creep that is quite shocking, isn't it? And do you think the non-crime hate incident stuff has been a little bit of a turning point for quite a lot of people who may not otherwise pay that much attention to the free speech crisis, but on this issue, I think a lot of people thought, what? Why are you recording things that are not criminal?
Yeah, I think, one of the good things to come out of the ordeal that Alison Pearson went through is that it really brought non-crime hate incidents kind of into the national spotlight. Because when the two police officers turned up on her doorstep, it sounded to her, and if you look at the transcript, it does sound as if they're investigating a non-crime hate incident. And so her initial reaction was, why am I being, harassed on Remembrance Sunday for something that isn't a crime? Why are they wasting police resources investigating a non-crime? And because of that, maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe it wasn't, but because of that, it really catapulted NCHIs into the national consciousness, and it cut through in a way it never has before. And we've been, the Free Speech Union has been campaigning against them for over 4 years, and we've worked with Harry Miller in his various lawsuits against Humberside Police, the College of Policing. But for some reason, it didn't quite register or land. But I think it really has now. As you say, I think people are absolutely horrified, particularly because, so many people have had experience of having their car broken into or their homes broken into, or a child who's mugged on their way back from school. They call the police expecting them to do something and discover that they're not going to do anything. And people just think, well, if you're so under-resourced, if you've got this manpower crisis that you can't investigate my son being mugged and punched in the face and his phone stolen when he came up from school yesterday, what on earth are you doing investigating non-crimes, sending 2, sometimes 5 people to people's homes because someone's reported them for a hate crime? I mean, the implication, Brendan, is that, if your house is burgled, before you call the police, make sure you get out a can of spray paint and spray "trans women aren't women" on your front door. And then you can tell the police that a hate crime has been committed on your property. And there'll be literally a police helicopter circling overhead within 30 seconds. I think you have to hand it to the College of Policing, which was a quango, incidentally, created by David Bonfire of the Quangos Cameron in 2014, who came up with the concept of non-crime hate incidents. I mean, you'd think they could have phrased it better. I mean, it sounds so Orwellian. I mean, to actually put non-crime in there, absolutely extraordinarily kind of tin-eared. The rationale. So when Harry Miller, I think it was when he appealed the outcome of his High Court trial, in which the High Court judge was very robust about condemning Humberside Police for recording an NCHI against him. Ex-copper, did work for Humberside Police, but didn't condemn the College of Policing for its guidance requiring the police to, on every occasion, record a report of a hate crime which turned out not to be a hate crime, to record it as an NCHI. Didn't criticise the College of Policing for that, so Harry appealed that in the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal gave this fantastic judgment and said that, no, this is the guidance that the College of Policing have issued, which is resulting in the police spending huge, ridiculous amounts of time and money investigating these non-crimes and recording them. That is an unlawful interference in our freedom of speech, a breach of Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Stop it. But one of the documents submitted as evidence by the College of Policing referenced this book called The Nature of Prejudice by someone called Gordon Allport, an American social psychologist who in the 1950s interviewed various Holocaust survivors of pogroms, the Warsaw Ghetto, etc. And one of the things he found is that they all said that the mistreatment of Jews in Europe had started with pejorative, prejudicial things said about them, insults in the street, nasty jokes, the othering of the Jewish population of continental Europe. This is how it began. And so he then came up with this kind of pyramid of hate concept. He didn't call it the pyramid of hate, but that's how it's been referred to by people who've kind of used his work subsequently. The idea being that you have kind of hurtful words about out groups at the bottom of the pyramid, and at the top you have genocide. Now, he didn't say in this book, which is quite nuanced, that hurty words inevitably led to genocide. He said in most cases they won't, but in some cases it's a necessary but insufficient condition of an escalation in the victimization of these othered groups. And that was interpreted by this, intellectual colossus at the College of Policing, former chief constable, as we have to nip these potential hate crimes in the bud by firing a warning shot across people's bows if they say something that doesn't meet the threshold for a hate crime, but nonetheless is clearly motivated by hostility, or at least in the eyes of the quote-unquote victim, motivated by hostility towards their membership of a protected group. And so they think they're doing God's work. They're like the pre-crime squad in Minority Report, stopping crimes from happening before they can be committed and protecting the most vulnerable in our society as a consequence. I mean, it's a ludicrous idea, and I'm not sure the police even really believe it, because one thing that Harry Miller did is he submitted FOIs to all 43 police forces in England and Wales to say, well, okay, the rationale for recording NCHIs, and incidentally, we think about 250,000 have been recorded in England and Wales alone since 2014, which is about 65 a day on average. If the rationale is that you're going to reduce the number of hate crimes by nipping them in the bud in this way, have you done any analysis? Have you actually looked at whether there are fewer hate crimes being committed post 2014 than there were before, or in those, regions where the police are more zealous about recording NCHIs, are there fewer hate crimes than in regions where the police are less zealous? And the reaction was just one of general bafflement. They didn't really understand the question, let alone have any data to show that they had actually tested the kind of Gordon Allport hypothesis, which was supposedly the rationale underlying this kind of Orwellian thought policing. And the reason I think they hadn't done any analysis is because really that's just a fig leaf. What it's really about is punishing people out with the law for heresy. That's what it's about. It doesn't matter if it has any positive social consequences. They just want people who are heretics to suffer.
That's right. And speaking of heresy, and you mentioned Harry Miller there, whose crime, of course, or rather non-crime, was to be skeptical of some of the claims of transgenderism. That's what landed him in hot water. And I did want to ask you about what is in some ways the main heresy of our times, which is to believe in biological sex and to think that there are men and there are women and one cannot become the other. I wanted to ask you where you think freedom of speech is at in relation to gender critical speech. So, because in my mind, this is a good example of an issue where it's one step forward and two steps back, or maybe two steps forward, but one step back. So, lots of women have really got it in the neck over the past few years for expressing their so-called gender critical beliefs. And the Free Speech Union has done some excellent work with those women defending their right to express themselves, to express these perfectly legitimate, legal, moral beliefs that they have, scientific beliefs. But then at the same time, there is still a culture of censorship around this question, and there's still a chilling effect. I'm sure there are lots of people out there who see J.K. Rowling get death threats and rape threats every day and think, well, I'm just going to keep quiet. So there is still a problem there. And in your piece, you mentioned that Labour promised in its manifesto a full trans-exclusive ban on conversion practices. And I think one of the great things about the work that you guys do at the Free Speech Union is that you're able to tease out the censorship consequences of all sorts of legislation. So when you say to someone they're going to ban conversion therapy, a lot of people would nod along and say, yeah, it's wrong for a priest to carry out an exorcism on a gay kid, or, whatever vision people might have of conversion therapy. But as you point out, this could potentially mean parents, health officials, doctors, discouraging a 10-year-old kid from going on puberty blockers or from changing their gender or from doing something that was probably going to have bad consequences for them in the future. That kind of thing could be encapsulated in this ban as well. So this is an issue, isn't it, where there have been some really good victories in relation to the right of people to express themselves, but there are still loads of problems. How do you see it panning out at the moment?
Yeah, I think people, have been slightly lulled into a false sense of security about this issue because of Maya Forstatter's victory, in which the Employment Appeals Tribunal said that, yes, expressing your belief in the biological reality of sex is a protected belief under the Equality Act. So if you fire a woman for doing that, that's an example of unlawful discrimination. And that was a huge victory, and it's been very important. And we cite it a lot at the Free Speech Union. But, and we had the Cass report, of course, and Britain is now known as Turf Island. And, in America, people point to the government's response to the Cass report and the ban on puberty blockers as a model for what should happen in America. But actually, there are still lots of problems, as you say. I mean, in the Free Speech Union's case database, the largest single category by far are those cases we code in Salesforce, sex and gender. And the vast, vast majority of those cases are women getting into trouble in the workplace or at universities for expressing their belief in the biological reality of sex, and they're still getting into trouble. We haven't seen any fall off in the number of sex and gender cases since the Forstater ruling, since the Cass report, since the ban on puberty blockers. The fact that gender critical beliefs now enjoy the protection of the Equality Act hasn't filtered down into most institutions, certainly not into the NHS, not into the civil service, across the public sector and in the private sector. It is still a form of heresy for which you can get into a lot of trouble, even though it's now legally protected. I mean, it's extraordinary. You'd think that, that HR officers, EDI officers would acquaint themselves with, the Equality Act as interpreted by the Employment Appeals Tribunal, whose rulings are binding and set precedents. But no, they've turned a blind eye to it. It's going to take quite a while, I think, before that problem's eliminated. I mean, as you say, it could get worse under this government when they do introduce a fully trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices. The ridiculous aspect of this particular moral crusade is that, as you say, the kind of thing that's conjured up by the phrase conversion therapy just isn't happening anymore. There's no evidence that it's happened for 15, 20 years. And most of the things that we think of as conversion therapy, such as, electroshock therapy for gay kids, are already against the law. So if it's not happening and it's against the law anyway, what is it that the government wants to ban? Well, it's hard to escape the suspicion that what they want to ban is conversations between medical professionals and parents in which they depart from the, affirmative care approach in which you're just supposed to kind of affirm the self-diagnosis of a gender-confused child and pack them off on an irreversible medical pathway. Anyone who dissents from that and says, no, hang on a minute, there could be some other issues going on here. Maybe you should undergo, a course of psychotherapy before making this life-changing decision, or maybe you should wait until you're 18. Anyone saying that seemingly could be caught by this new ban on conversion practices and end up, spending time in prison, and you only have to prosecute a couple of people to kind of have a hugely chilling effect. But just if they change the law, even before anyone's prosecuted, it could have a very chilling effect. So there is a fully trans-inclusive ban on conversion therapy in the state of Victoria in Australia. No one has actually been prosecuted for, trying to dissuade their child from taking puberty blockers or having surgery. But the fact that they could be, the fact that a medical professional could be, has meant that parents who have gender-confused adolescent children who want to start embarking on these irreversible pathways can't find psychotherapists that they can send them to that would kind of urge them to take a different approach or would maybe talk them out of it, because no one dares practice if they don't endorse the kind of gender affirmative care model for fear that they might be prosecuted, even if no one has been already. So it would have an extraordinarily chilling effect and make it much, much harder to try and stop confused adolescents from making these decisions, which, most of the time they come to regret.
Okay, Toby, a couple more questions for you. I want to ask you about what's happening on campuses at the moment, because they have been hotbeds of woke censorship and sometimes outright hysteria over the past few years. I've written about it. You've written about it. It's been quite a spectacle to behold. I don't tend to speak on campuses that much anymore because I think it's more hassle than it's worth. And, who wants to be shouted at by some snotty-nosed 19-year-old kid? So it's kind of something I tend to avoid these days. So I wanted to get your thought on how things are going there. And of course, one of the things that you guys will be doing in January, I think, is appealing against Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary's abandonment of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which would have protected academics and students from, the worst excesses of cancel culture. So you'll be having that battle with the Education Secretary to try to ensure that freedom of speech has a fighting chance on the 21st century campus. What is the culture like on campuses now? What is your hopes that you might achieve with this kind of pushback?
Well, I guess this comes down to the ultimate question of whether culture is downstream from law or law is downstream from culture. And one of the arguments against the Higher Education Freedom of Speech bill when it was going through Parliament was that you can't change the culture by changing the law. And, you're going about trying to foster in the meantime, keep a more intellectually tolerant atmosphere on university campuses by changing the law. That's not going to work. To which our standard response, but we were advocates for this particular bill, the Free Speech Union was, well, the Equality Act sure as hell changed the culture. That was passed in 2010, and it's had an extraordinary impact on all of our lives, not just the public sector. It may be that you can't, other things need to be done in addition to changing the law, but changing the law can have a really significant impact on culture. And I think the main difference that the Higher Ed Freedom of Speech Act, had it been implemented in full, would have made is that it would have made it easier for students and lecturers and visiting speakers to hold universities' feet to the fire when it came to upholding free speech on campus and academic freedom. It didn't really increase, it didn't create kind of it didn't change the threshold of what is and isn't acceptable speech, which is one of the criticisms that Bridget Phillipson and others made of the Act and part of the rationale for torpedoing it. But it didn't suddenly, it wasn't going to make, anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial acceptable on campus. That's a red herring. It didn't extend the parameters of what speech will be protected beyond what's already protected by Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. What it did was it created a couple of enforcement mechanisms to make sure that the speech which universities are already supposed to protect was in fact protected. So it would have, if you thought your speech rights had been breached by a university, you could, under the Act, you'd be able to complain to the Office for Students, to Arif Ahmed, the Free Speech Czar at the Office for Students, and if he upheld your complaint, he could fine a university. And if that didn't work, there was going to be a statutory tort as a kind of ultimate kind of fallback. But anyway, as you say, Labour have squashed this Act, and we think that decision was unconstitutional and therefore unlawful because it's a breach of the fundamental constitutional principle that a minister of the Crown cannot defy the will of Parliament. It was passed in the last Parliament by both houses. It enjoyed cross-party support. And one of the ironies of Bridget Phillipson's rationale for torpedoing this, lots of clauses were supposed to be implemented on the 1st of August, and she revoked the commencement orders, so they weren't. And part of her rationale was that she wanted to end the culture war. And it's hard to get your head around what she meant. But, this did represent an end to one theatre in the culture war. There had been achieved cross-party consensus that free speech on English university campuses, it doesn't apply beyond English universities, needed to be better protected, that there really is a problem. People are being no platform. People are self-censoring. Academics are getting into trouble for challenging various aspects of radical progressive ideology. Gendercritical feminists are finding it harder and harder to kind of get research grants and so forth. People finally acknowledge that there is a problem. If we want our universities to remain world class, we need to do something to better protect academic freedom and free speech on our campuses. Otherwise, they're just going to turn into woke madrasas. And there was a cross-party consensus. This bill enjoyed a huge amount of support in both houses of Parliament. That was an end to this particular facet of the culture war. A consensus had been achieved. And she's essentially reopened. She's restarted that particular war. She hasn't ended it. Anyway, so as you say, the Free Speech Union has its day in court on January 23rd, in which we want to argue that what she's done is unlawful. It's a judicial review, and we'll see how that turns out. But if we win, then the government will either have to implement the Freedom of Speech Act in full, or use its majority in Parliament to repeal it. And our hope is that if we do win, they won't want to extend that fight or remind people that the court decided that one of the stars of Starmer's cabinet did something unlawful, so they'll just quietly implement the act in full. Anyway, that's our hope. I mean, it's judicial reviews are incredibly expensive and it's quite risky. And but we felt, this was the one really big legislative act of the last Parliament, which actually was going to do something to put more robust protections in place for free speech, at least on English university campuses. We fought for it. We've been involved in fighting for it at every step of the way. And we felt we just had to, do whatever we could to try and save what was, we think, the biggest and most important achievement of ours and other free speech campaigners in the last Parliament. So we'll see how it turns out.
Well, best of luck with that case in January. We'll all be watching. Toby, my last question for you is on, I guess, the future of wokeness, for want of a better word, the future of cancel culture and all these terrible things that have grown up over the past few years, past few decades, in fact. And I wanted to ask you where you stand on the idea that wokeness is on the wane or it's on its way out. And you mentioned earlier that you fear that people have been lulled into a false sense of security on the gendercritical question or the sex realism question. And I think you're probably right on that, in fact. I feel similarly about the claims that wokeness is dying or being put out to pasture. I feel ever so slightly pessimistic about that. I know why people say it. Donald Trump has had his second victory this year. We're going to have a new Trump administration, which will have a ripple effect across the world next year. There's more freedom of speech on X than there was on Twitter. People feel freer to say things that you were supposedly not allowed to say. There is a pushback from feminists and others against the gender ideology. So interesting, good, positive things are happening. But it seems to me that wokeness is still very entrenched in the institutions, including schools and universities and workplaces. So I think it's probably a harder beast to shake than some people recognize. So I wonder where you stand on, is wokeness dying or is it just getting started? How do you see it?
Yeah, well, I used to, at every annual Free Speech Union party, in the speech I made, I used to claim that we'd reached peak woke. And the pendulum was now going to start swinging back our way. And after a bit, I retired that speech because it just seemed to be naively optimistic. I mean, I feel sometimes like a man falling through a burning building in which you think you've reached rock bottom. Finally, the nightmare's at an end, and then the floor gives way again, and you're screaming, you're falling. And I think Trump's victory, Elon Musk's purchase of X, the Cass report, all of these things I think have contributed to a feeling that the zeitgeist has shifted. And that's been very important, not least because one of the most powerful rhetorical arguments that, woke activists deploy is that they're on the right side of history. And you might as well get with the program now because you'll only have to do so later. And you'll just be embarrassed by the fact that you opposed things like the Gender Recognition Act, just as the Conservatives were embarrassed about the fact that they once opposed gay marriage. So, get with the program. We're on the right side of history. Don't be left behind, you antediluvian, male, pale and stale bore. And that was, I think, a powerful argument and persuaded a lot of people to go along with something that they didn't necessarily believe, not strongly anyway. But if that is your argument, that you're on the right side of history and that everything is moving your way, then if you suffer, a really bad defeat at the ballot box or in the courts, it gives the lie to that notion. It makes you look suddenly weak, and I think that's been really significant, and it's put a lot of woke warriors on the back foot. But as you say, there may have been a shift in the zeitgeist, and amongst the chattering classes, the idea may have got abroad that woke is on its way out. But radical progressive ideology is just really deeply embedded in all kinds of institutions, in all aspects of our culture. And it's going to take more than an election victory by Donald Trump to make any difference. I mean, that was obvious in 2016. If anything, Trump's victory in 2016 turbocharged the woke movement. They could point to this kind of white supremacist in the White House and say, see, our warnings were right. You know, we are at risk of genuine fascism. Yeah. And they've tried the same arguments this time around. I mean, they have much less cut through because, you know, we can look at what Trump did in those 4 years and whatever the benefits and costs of his, you know, administration, he wasn't a fascist. So, you know, it feels different this time, as though it's not going to act. Trump's victory is not going to be like applying a defibrillator to the kind of corpse of the woke movement. But it does feel different this time. But, you know, let's not underestimate the forces amassed on the other side. I mean, you know, they've got much more money. They're much better supported. There are many more of them. You know, just winning one battle does not win a war. So I think it's going to be years, possibly decades, before we see any really significant change.
Toby, thank you very much.
Thank you.